Good morning. This is Rajeshkumar. Today we are going to analyze one problem question with related to murder, loss of control, and causation. The video content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. Kindly go through this slide completely. Jack and Asif have an argument. During the quarrel, Asif pushes Jack violently and aims a punch at Jack. Jack stands his ground and punches Asif in the face. Asif falls over, hits his head, and loses consciousness. Jack is shocked and upset and tries to rescue Asif. When this fall to work, he concludes wrongly that Asif is dead. He drags Asif's body upstairs, hitting Asif's head several times on the stairs in the process. Jack places Asif on the bed and calls an ambulance. When the ambulance arrives, Asif is still alive. However, Piotr, an ambulance worker, stumbles when entering the bedroom and falls on top of Asif. This precipitates Asif's death. Medical evidence shows that the first blow was unlikely to have caused Asif's death, and that death was caused by combined effect of all the blows to the head Asif had suffered when Jack dragged him upstairs and Piotr's accidental fall. We have to discuss the evidences. We have to analyze the scenario. Analysis of Jack's liability for Asif's death, the criminal homicide. Jack's action could make him liable for murder or the constructive manslaughter, depending on his intent and the circumstances surrounding Asif's death. Murder is defined as the unlawful killing of a person under the Kuhn's peace with malice aforethought. The prosecution must prove that Jack caused Asif's death and had the necessary mens rea, an intention to kill or cause a grievous bodily harm, as established in R versus Cunningham in 1982. The initial punch by Jack was not delivered with the intent to kill or cause the grievous bodily harm, but rather in self defense. However, the subsequent blows to Asif's head while dragging him upstairs could potentially indicate recklessness. The issue here is whether Jack's action amounted to a gross negligence or implied malice, the elements critical to a murder conviction. If the murder cannot be established, Jack may be liable for constructive manslaughter. This offense requires an unlawful act, that the act was dangerous, causation, and death. Unlawful act. The violent punch delivered by Jack during the quarrel constitute an assault, which satisfies the requirement for an unlawful act under Orr versus Franklin case in 1883. Additionally, a dragging Asif's body and causing further injuries, believing him to be dead, and also constitute an unlawful act. Dangerousness. The act must be objectively dangerous, meaning it would cause the harm in the view of the reasonable person, as in R versus Church case in 1966. A reasonable person would foresee that dragging Asif, who appear unconscious, could cause harm. The, the next one is causation. The causation is central to determining the Jack's liability. The prosecution must establish both the factual causation, as in R versus White case in 1910, and the legal causation, as in R versus Smith case in 1959. The blow to Asif's head during the dragging significantly contributed to his death, satisfying the factual causation. Regarding the legal causation, the chain of causation is not broken by Piotr's accidental fall, as it was forcibly event resulting from a Jack's earlier action, as in R versus Pagat case in 1983. The combined effect of Jack's action and Pietro's fall causes Asif's death. In other words, Jack may face a charge of constructive manslaughter rather than murder. The murder under the Section 1 of the Homicide Act 1957 requires the defendant have intent to kill or cause a grievous bodily harm. There is no evidence in the fact that Jack intended to kill Asif or cause the grievous bodily harm when he punched Asif in response to Asif's violent action. While R versus Cunningham in 1957 case had defined the recklessness as being aware of an unjustifiable risk of harm, that Jack's initial punch was likely more of a reactive measure in the context of the quarrel rather than a premeditated act intended to cause serious harm. Moreover, the subsequent blows to Osif's head while dragging his body upstairs were likely reckless, but they did not seem to demonstrate the mens rea for murder. Given the lack of evidence of an intent to kill or cause the grievous bodily harm, the most appropriate charge is the constructive manslaughter under the Section 2 of the Homicide Act 1957. In R versus Larkin case, the court confirmed that the constructive manslaughter occurs when the defendant commits an unlawful act that is dangerous and cause death even if they do not did not intend to cause death or the serious injury. The Jack's action of punching Asif and subsequently dragging his body upstairs through a non-intended to kill were unlawful and led to Asif's death. As R versus Franklin case further explains, the constructive manslaughter can result from the commission of an unlawful act that objectively poses a risk of harm, which fits the scenario here. A defense of self-defense. Jack's initial punch may be justified under the self-defense as outlined in Section 76 of the Criminal Justice and Immigration Act 2008. The defense requires the use of reasonable force in response to an imminent threat. In R versus Gladstone William case in 1984, the court held that the defendant believed in the necessity of force need only to be genuine and not reasonable. The Jacks believed that he needed to defend himself against Asif, a violent push, and the attempted punch likely satisfies this requirement. However, the proportionality and the force used is critical. Under the Palmer versus in the Palmer case in 1971, the force used in self-defense must not be excessive. The punching Asif in the face could be seen as unproportionate in response to Asif's aggression. Nevertheless, the defense of self-defense does not extend to Jack's subsequent action of dragging Asif upstairs, which were not motivated by any threat. In other words, Jack may attempt to argue the self defense for the initial punch he threw at Asif. The self defense allows for the use of force in response to an imminent threat. R versus Palmer case in 1971 established that a defendant can use a reasonable force to defend themselves. An R versus Beckford case in 1982 extended this to cases where the defendant honestly believe they are in the danger even if the belief is mistaken. In this case, Asif pushed a Jack violently and aimed a punch at him, and Jack's immediate response of the punching Asif could be seen as a proportional reaction to defend himself. However, the issue arises after the initial punch when the Jack continued to act aggressively by dragging Asif's body upstairs and hitting his head multiple times. The proportionality of Jack's action is crucial here. R versus AG reference number 2 of the case 1983 stresses that self defense requires a reasonable response. That Jack's subsequent actions in dragging Osip's body and continuing to hit his head while trying to risk him appear excessive, as they are no longer a response to an immediate threat, but instead a post incident reaction. Thus, the self defense is unlikely to be available as a defense for the continued harm inflicted after Osif lost the consciousness. Causation. Causation plays a vital role in determining the Jack's liability. It is classified as factual causation and legal causation. The factual causation, the but-for test, must be satisfied, as in R versus White case in 1910. But for Jack's punch and subsequent dragging of Asif upstairs, Asif would not have died. This satisfies the factual causation. About the legal causation, the Jack's action must be significant and operative cause of Asif's death, as in R versus Cheshire case in 1991. While the pivotal fall contributed to the Amasiv death, it does not break the chain of causation because it was not so independent of Jack's action as to render them insignificant. Jack's dragging of Asif and the resulting head injuries remains a substantial cause. In other words, causation is a critical issue in this case, particularly because Asif's death occurred as a result of a combination of events, including the initial punch, the dragging of his body, and the pointer's accident fall. The legal principle of causation requires that a defendant action be a substantial cause of victim's death. In R versus Smith case, the court held that the defendant action do not break the chain of causation if they were a substantial and operative cause of death. The fact that fighter's fall contributed to Asif's death does not necessarily break the chain of causation, as the initial unlawful act, that is the punch, and the subsequent rough treatment of Asif's body, set the events in motion. The case of R versus Taboli Mali in 1954 case is relevant here. In this case, the defendants were convicted of manslaughter for causing the death after a series of actions, even though they mistakenly thought the victim was dead. The court found that the defendants combined action, which include an unlawful act, the initial punch, and subsequent harm, were sufficient to establish the causation, even though the death was not immediately caused by the initial unlawful act. This principle applies to Jack's case, where the combination of his action, punching, dragging the body, and the injury from fighter's fall can be seen as an unbroken chain of causation leading to Asif's death. Causation and the supposed cause issue. Another important aspect is the supposed cause issue. In R versus Church case in 1996, the court held that where a defendant commits an act such as attempting to dispose of a victim, thinking the victim is dead when they are not, the chain of causation may not be broken. Similarly, in R versus Thabo Meli case, the defendants were convicted of manslaughter after mistakenly thinking the victim was dead when they threw him off a cliff. Jack's belief that Asif was dead when he dragged his body upstairs mirrored this scenario. His wrong belief that Asif was dead did not break the chain of causation. The combined act of harms contributed to the eventual death, making Jack liable for the manslaughter. To conclude, Jack is unlikely to be convicted of murder due to the absence of the intent to kill or cause the grievous bodily harm. However, he is likely liable for constructive manslaughter because his unlawful and dangerous act directly contributed to Osif's death. The defense of self-defense might mitigate liability for the initial punch, but cannot justify the subsequent dragging of Osif, which caused a significant harm. Pilatus' fall, while contributing to the fatal outcome, does not break the chain of causation. Therefore, Jack's liability for Osif's death is best framed under constructive manslaughter. In other words, the Fred's potential criminal liability primarily centers on constructive manslaughter, his action, punching the Osif and dragging him by the head, led to Osif's death, even though he did not to intend to kill Osif. The defense of self-defense is unlikely to succeed after the initial punch, as his actions were excessive and not proportional to the threat. Once Asif had lost the consciousness, Causation is satisfied by the chain of events, including the initial punch, the dragging of body, and the pietas fall, which all contributed to Asif's death. This case highlights the key concepts of constructive manslaughter, self-defense, and causation, which significant case law presented, such as R versus Smith, R versus Taboli, and R versus Church, is being applicable here. Thank you.